Hello, and welcome to Running the Table, the podcast where we run through everything on the table in the world of sports. And we're continuing our conference breakdowns in college basketball. We just covered the Big East. Now we're going to go over the Big 12, the second of our Power Six conferences. This is going to be a fun one to cover. Tim, you ready to get into it?
Let's run it.
Let's go. So the Big 12 is one of the most complete conferences in college basketball from top to bottom. They don't really have any bad teams per se. Like the worst teams in the Big 12 are just under 500. And as far as the top teams in the Big 12 go, you got Baylor, Kansas, Texas Tech that could potentially compete for a national title. So I think we should get into it with the first team being the defending national champions, the Baylor Bears. They're back to being one of the elites in college basketball after that rough stretch filled with, injuries and inconsistent play, but they're back now. That win against Kansas over this past week was huge for them, a double-digit win. They got elite guard play from James Akinjo. He's been the perfect fill-in from last year's championship team. You bring back Adam Flagler, Jonathan Tchamwa-Tchatchoua, Flo Thamba, and you've got the makings of Scott Drew and the Baylor Bears going potentially back-to-back.
Yeah, Scott Drew really definitely did a very good job of retooling a team that lost quite a bit to the draft from their national championship roster a year ago. But you're right, James Akinjo has been a great filler for some of that guard play that they lost. Flagler has done a great job of getting points for them when they need it most. And some of those guys down low have done a great job filling out that defense that the Baylor Bears are so well known for. But they're one of the premier defenses, of course, that we've always talked about. They average around 9 steals a game while also having a very potent offense that scores around 77 points per game. So they're a really solid team. They've gotten themselves back on track with that statement win that, of course, skyrocketed them back up in the rankings and have them back up as a number 1 seed currently. But they are by and far one of the most complete teams in all of college basketball right now. So it's hard to bet against the Baylor Bears when they come into town.
Mm-hmm. Well, after you got Baylor, you got the team that they beat on Saturday, the Kansas Jayhawks. And as far as 1 and 2 in the Big 12 goes, Kansas is right behind Baylor. This is another big, strong Big 12 team that on paper, I think they have the strength to win the whole thing. The problem is that it doesn't exactly play out like that all the time. You're led by Ochai. I always struggle with the last name. Ochai Agbaji. Yeah. Yes, nailed it. I get Tchamwa-Tchatchoua so easily, but I struggle with
it's Ochai that gets you.
Yeah, it's Ochai that gets me. But it's not Ochai that is bringing down Kansas on the court. It's inconsistent point guard play and inconsistent big men play. I mean, you look at their roster on paper, DeJuan Harris, Christian Braun, David McCormack, and it's a really good roster on paper. I mean, I keep going back to that fact, but it just doesn't play out like that on the court.
Yeah, there's a lot of teams that have the talent and have the guys that on paper they look to be really, really solid, but game in and game out, sometimes it's hard to get all of those guys working seamlessly together. And I think Kansas sometimes can be one of those teams where sometimes not all the pieces click quite right together. And one thing that's always interesting to note about certain teams is this Kansas Jayhawks team does not go very deep into their bench, only going 7, maybe 8 guys at most. But it's about their main 6 or 7 that they usually try to run with. And none of their top 4 scorers average less than 5 rebounds per game. That includes 2 of their guards. So a very solid rebounding team in that aspect with getting guys out of or getting the most out of all of their guys on the floor. But it's just whether or not they're all playing well at the right time. Obviously, Ochai Agbaji has just had a stellar season, as cementing himself as one of the best guards in the nation. But it's just what can the pieces around him do on a consistent basis? Now, granted, it's hard to argue with 23-5, but those have been some of the reasons of why they've dropped some of those uncharacteristic games throughout the season that in theory, they really should have won.
Yeah. And, is going into the conference tournament, into the NCAA tournament. Kansas will work on playing up to their potential, and I will work on pronouncing Ochai Agbaji's last name. Don't worry. I'll get there.
We'll get there one day.
One day. But after that, we have the Texas Tech Red Raiders. Over the course of the college basketball videos for this year on this channel, we've talked about Texas Tech a lot, and for good reason. They're an athletic team. They're really good defensively, and they've bought into what they are. And I think the aspect of the way Texas Tech plays that's really unique from the rest of these teams is that they get energy on offense from getting defensive stops, which is really unique. Like normally when a team gets momentum, it's, because you made a couple shots in a row, you've gone on an offensive run, but you don't really see it from a team that gets a bunch of defensive stops, and that gives them the momentum to go, carry out and score on offense. So, they're a 3 seed right now. They've been, towards the top 10 for the last couple weeks, and this team can do some damage in the Big 12 outside of Baylor and Kansas, in my opinion.
Yeah, no kidding. You talk about a team and their uniqueness in some of that aspect. But one of the things that I noted about this team is they're a fantastic team at home, going an undefeated 12-0 at home and having all 7 of their losses coming on the road. And I think part of that has to do with the Red Raider fan base that's just had a fire lit under them after Chris Beard pretty shockingly left them for the other Texas team, Texas Longhorns. And they've had some real fantastic statement wins throughout the season that's risen them up in the rankings. And they've proven that they very much belong with some of the best, not only in this conference, but in the country as well.
Yeah, you talk about that environment. The home court advantage that Texas Tech has is absolutely no joke at all.
Yeah. Yeah, they're a solid defensive team. With a little bit of like that streaky offense you talk about, is that defense fuels their offense. But they've had some really statement games. And I think that's helped them kind of build momentum. I know we've talked about them previously and the role of some of the transfers, like Kevin O'Banner from Oral Roberts having a nice little role on that team. Don't want to kind of repeat myself talking more about him, but they've just got quite a few role guys that have been very solid for them throughout the season.
He is worth mentioning because he's been such a contributor for Texas Tech.
Yeah, he was a crucial piece for them to add some of that consistency on this team, and I think he's really helped them round out some of that missing pieces for this Texas Tech team that has shown to be much more solid this season.
Mm-hmm. We talked about Chris Beard's old team. Let's talk about his new team, the Longhorns. This is another good defensive team. They allow less than 60 points per game, 59.1, but they don't score nearly as much or as efficiently as some of the other elite offenses in the Big 12 to consider themselves like in that upper echelon with Texas Tech, with Baylor, with Kansas. They're fantastic in terms of like Christian Bishop. He's a pretty good blocker. Timmy Allen, their leading scorer, rebounder, and he's leading the team in steals. So you got guys that can put in some major work on the defensive end. But as far as offense goes, some question marks there.
Yeah, a very defensive-minded team, and they're another one that kind of builds off of their defensive play. And I think some of that focus on their defense has been because of some of their inconsistency on offense. And it's interesting to note 2 of their transfer guys that they've got, and that would be Marcus Carr, previously from Minnesota, and Christian Bishop from Creighton, having stepped in Texas in their first year. And they filled some much needed holes for this Longhorns team. But one of the things that I noted is, like, I've been very aware of the success of Marcus Carr in the Big Ten previously. And he's definitely taken a step back in his first season with Texas and in his offensive capability, where he averaged 19.4 points per game in his last season at Minnesota, where he's dropped to averaging a solid 11.2, but it's just not quite the offensive spark that you're used to seeing a guy like Marcus Carr bring, like he did with the Golden Gophers.
Yeah, it's not nearly the same because, like, Marcus Carr was the guy in Minnesota.
Yeah, he's in a different role in Texas. He's not the offense is not always flowing through him like it was in Minnesota.
They don't need Marcus Carr to score 20 a game, so he's not.
Yeah.
But If Texas can fix some of that inconsistency on offense, I think they can make some noise. But after that, we got another Texas team that has really flown under the radar for most of the season, but a good win against Texas Tech has put TCU firmly on the bubble talk. And like right now, they're projected a 9 seed. And that win against Texas Tech, led by Mike Miles, they've been running, they've been marching to the beat of their own drum. And if they continue to play well, they could march right to the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, they're definitely a team that I think that surprised some with their record and some of their wins, but also, like you said, flown under the radar nonetheless. That win over Texas Tech definitely put them back on the map a little bit. But I think one of the things that has been, I would say, their biggest struggle and caused them to lose those 9 games that they have has been turnovers, where they've been a little sloppy with the ball, turning the ball over almost 15 times a game, which of course, kind of no matter how good you are on defense, it's a little hard to keep up on the offense.
Turnovers are killers.
Yeah,
turnovers are absolute
they
killers. They're,
Yeah, you miss out on those offensive possessions, but you also make it a lot easier on the defense to potential or on the other team's offense to get those easy points off turnovers.
In layman's terms, I think what you're saying is it's very hard to make baskets when you don't have the basketball.
That is typically how basketball works as a sport. So I would have to agree with you there. But yeah, so
you need the basketball to point.
Exactly. If they can fix some of those turnover problems, I think they could be a much more consistent team. Aim for that. It's always like that coach's goal to get like 10 or fewer. If they can get more near that mark heading into this final week of the season. And in terms of final weeks of the season, they have arguably one of the most crucial in terms of them being right around on bubble talk and the games that they have scheduled. They have a back-to-back with, I believe are they the team that has a back-to-back with Kansas? Or is that another team? I remember one of the teams here has a back-to-back with Kansas.
Well, I mean,
yes, that is.
It's gonna be crucial for Texas Tech, or not Texas Tech, TCU.
TCU is the team. They have 2 back-to-back games this week, Tuesday and Thursday. One at home, one at Kansas. If they're able to squeak one of those wins, then they're pretty much, I would say, firmly in the tournament. And then of course,
splitting against Kansas would be huge for the Horned Frogs.
Yeah, so that's gonna be real big for them, seeing what they can do coming out of this week. And they also even have a third game this week. Their last game of the regular season being against Texas. So this week of these 3 games is going to be crucial to see if they can scrape out a win or even 2. Would just completely solidify their place, and then see what momentum they can build in the tournament.
Yeah, over the last week, TCU is trying to put the nation on notice. After that, you go to Ames, Iowa, and you take a look at the Iowa State Cyclones. They had a stretch where they dropped their last 4, but then they went on a stretch where they won 4 in a row. So they're 7-9 in conference play, and they're looking to finish out against Oklahoma State and Baylor. And I think the short-term goal for Iowa State is get to 500 in conference play. A win against Oklahoma State is completely manageable for this Iowa State team. And it's the Baylor game that's going to be the real test. It's not exactly, are they going to get in the tournament per se, because they're projected a 7 seed right now, and they're at 20 wins for the regular season. I mean, they've gone 13-0 out of conference. So it's not exactly that like their place is in question. It's just the momentum heading into the Big 12 tournament. A win against Baylor to wrap up the regular season would be huge for them.
Yeah, exactly. Like you say, it's not about whether or not they're going to get in. It's what kind of momentum they'll have and what kind of basketball they're playing when it gets to that time. Because like you said, all 9 of their losses have come in this tough Big 12 conference. And they've been a pretty streaky team with those winning streaks and losing streaks. And to be fair, it's like you got to give them credit for going on this 4-game winning streak that they have lately. Now, granted, it hasn't been against some of the upper echelon teams really, but 4 wins is 4 wins. And they're a very solid. They're a very solid team in terms of offensive ability, with Isaiah Brockington leading the charge at almost 18 points a game. But it's just, what are you going to get outside of those main couple of guys? Because they're pretty star heavy in that aspect. So in terms of balanced team, that's where I think they have some shortcomings there. And that very well might be their undoing in tournament games. because that's always going to be the talk for teams is how are you going to take away their big time playmakers and who steps up when they do. And I feel like we'll be echoing that sentiment for a lot of these teams that have really big star play, but it's still very much true here for the Cyclones.
And those are the teams that are poised to make the tournament right now in the Big 12. I mean, we left out 4 others: Oklahoma State, Kansas State, Oklahoma, and West Virginia. It doesn't look like they're going to be in the tournament, at least at large, because they're all hovering at or around 500. Yeah. Is it possible that they could wake up and steal the Big 12? Maybe. It's unlikely, but who knows? This is March. Tim, you got anything else for the Big 12?
No, I mean, I think the biggest thing to note about the Big 12 is just like you talk about like how overall talented they are for like your bottom 4 teams to all sort of be hanging around that 500 mark. Not a whole lot of conferences have that. But it's like you've got some of these teams where realistically any of them have a chance of doing some damage. It's just a matter of if you can get all the pieces at the right time and whether or not the other team has an off game. But like you said, that's why we play these games. That's why we have these conference tournaments, to give some of these lower end teams a chance to make some of those miracles happen. So it'll be real interesting to watch. And the Big 12 tournament will be a very special one to see of who's going to come out of it.
Well, let's answer that question. Who will come out of it?
Yeah, I mean, this one is really tough because, I mean, you talk about, like we said, the overall talent and especially the upper echelon being as high and talented as it is. I don't know. I just the natural choice is Baylor, but
that's not how that works.
No, and that's the thing. And I have this inkling about this Bill Self-led Kansas team, and I feel like Ochai Agbaji and crew is just going to be able to muster enough in terms of like the overall offensive play and making sure their defensive side of the ball is strong enough that I think that Kansas will sort of come with a bit of a vengeance against this Baylor team, who obviously just put a little beating on them and whatnot. And I think this Kansas team is going to have what it takes. You talk about a team that always has big game experience season in and season out. So I've got the Jayhawks taking this one.
Rock chalk. And as far as I go, again, there are a bunch of options that you could pick, and you hit the nail right on the head, at least with that point. Baylor's the safe option. I'll go with Baylor, even though I know darn well that that's not how March works, and it is very much still up for grabs, and the best team does not always win. But when I look at the Big 12, I still think Baylor is the best team. They're very skilled on offense to keep you on your toes on defense. You know, we talked about all of the stars that they have, and they're looking to run it back. So I think they're going to come out hot in the Big 12 tournament. Yeah,
it's really hard to argue against and bet against teams that have that really solid defense, because that's hard to turn on in any given day, in any given game. Sometimes teams can just be hot on offense and just be knocking down shots, but it's really hard to have a shockingly good defensive game. And that's where Baylor kind of sets themselves away from the rest of the crowd. But like you said, it's why you play the game, and it'll be a sure fun game to watch if they do get matched up in the championship.
That's all we got for the Big 12. We covered the Big East. We took a look at some mid-major teams, and we got some more conferences coming up. We're going to be covering the rest of the Power Six. The Pac-12 will be next, so stay tuned for that, and a bunch of other college basketball content on Running the Table. We can't wait to bring it to you. So until next time, like and subscribe, and we out.